here for the Universal Service Panel? Very exciting. Okay, great to hear. My name's Staci Pies. I'm with INCOMPAS, and I really appreciate you staying post-lunch to talk about this really important topic. I know it's sort of a small crowd, so if you want to come closer to the front, that'd be awesome. Intimate. It's an intimate crowd, not a small crowd.
We won't bite. Hard.
And one of the reasons why we want you to be close is we're going to try and do a little bit of audience interaction, just like the Next Gen Rising panel did, but we're talking about universal service. And those of you who have been around and know about the Universal Service Fund know that we're at a crucial point with the fund. And I made this joke on a call as we were preparing for this panel, but I'm going to make it again for the rest of you because you're going to love it. But early in my career, we were working on contribution reform, and the rate was just still creeping up over 10%. And it was a crisis. And today, it's nearly 40%. And it truly is a crisis, not just because of the 40% and the impact that charging that fee to turn it over to USAC has on your business models, but because your business models are changing. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to know what should be assessed and what shouldn't be assessed. And so that's going to make a critical difference. So we've got the bipartisan congressional working group that hopefully is working on this issue, and we're going to discuss that. And we've got Chairman Carr, who has made several public comments about the need to reform both the contribution and the distribution methodologies. So there is momentum. Just to give you a minute here about where INCOMPAS has stood, INCOMPAS filed comments both 2 years ago and recently with the Congressional Working Group advocating for reform of the distribution methodology, taking into account how much money has flown into the system through BEAD funding and ARPA funding and all the other programs, and taking a look at how much is actually necessary going forward, and then looking at the contribution methodology. So we've got this amazing panel today, all lawyers, right? Yes, I was going to say lawyers and policy experts, but lawyers and policy experts combined. At the far end, Celia Lewis from JSI. We've got, oh no, I am messed up. Okay, John Heitman. Hi, John.
Easy, right?
Oh, the only man on the panel, loving it. Okay, John Heitman with Nelson Mullins, Tamar with Cooley, and Danielle Burt with Morgan Lewis. And I have worked with all of these people, but not when it was around 10%. Maybe the two of you in the middle there. And they're experts on these issues, and I'm going to ask them to start with a small introduction, not just with their names, because maybe that's not all that telling for you, but kind of who they represent and what interests they represent. And then we'll launch into some of the questions. So we want this to be interactive. We want to make USF fun today. So please join me in that effort, and we'll start here with Danielle.
Yeah. Well, hello, I'm Danielle Burt. I'm a partner at Morgan Lewis, and Morgan Lewis has been involved in universal service matters for quite some time. We've represented a wide swath of the industry, including most recently with filing some amicus briefs at the Supreme Court in light of the recent challenges to the constitutionality of USF. We certainly are also involved in the day-to-day, both in terms of understanding how to apply some of the distribution mechanisms and the contribution basis, and are happy today to talk about how we can reform some of those systems.
Fantastic. Tamar?
I'm Tamar Finn. I'm a partner at Cooley. I have been representing clients on universal service issues since the first report and order came out. So I've been doing contribution advice, appeals, audits, and E-rate, high cost, lifeline. So I kind of work across both distribution and contribution aspects of the program, as well as deal diligence on USF issues, which unfortunately can be trying sometimes. Surprises in deals are never good, but when there's a USF liability, then you have to take care of that as well. So clients in the fiber space who use E-rate to enter new markets, clients who are primarily contributors and are concerned about the contribution rate. And thank you for having me.
Thank you. John?
John Hyben, I'm a partner in the DC office of Nelson Mullins. I've been doing, like Tamar, USF stuff since the late 90s. It was involved in the very first order. I spent a lot of time on contributions with clients and trying to minimize their exposure. And that comes in the context of compliance counseling, but also audit and appeals and due diligence, as Tamar was mentioning. I also spend a lot of time on the distribution side, working with clients in particular programs. Low-income program in particular, Lifeline, I spent a lot of time on. Also spend time in the Rural Healthcare Program and E-rate. And so we can talk a little bit about the distribution side as well. The only one we don't do a whole lot of is E-rate. It's high cost, but we do some investigations and enforcement work there as well. So where there's USF, there's enforcement.
Indeed. And Celia?
I'm Celia Lewis. I am at JSI, headquartered in our Greenbelt, Maryland office. I am the policy director. A little over a year ago, Intercera also became part of JSI. We provide a complete suite of compliance solutions and tax management services to telecommunications and broadband providers. Most recently, I retired from the FCC after 25 years. If you want to learn more about that, contact me afterwards. And I've worked across multiple bureaus at the FCC, including enforcement, wireline competition, and most recently, the Office of Managing Director. And in my time in the Office of Managing Director, worked a lot with USAC and the Wireline Competition Bureau on audits, lots of audits. So happy to be here and contribute to this conversation.
Fantastic. So diverse array of experience and very deep on these issues. Before we start with the questions, I would like to ask the audience, how many of you in your day-to-day roles do not deal with the Universal Service Fund or some aspect of the fund? Not very many. Okay, we got an energy guy back there. We're going to teach you all about it. Well, I think that's great. I'm glad you're here, because one of the things that's so important about USF is that it is not just a policy and regulatory issue. It's not just about compliance and audits, but it impacts your business. And understanding how it impacts your business is really critical to enabling all of us to be effective advocates on the right structure for the Universal Service Fund. So in that vein, I'm going to kick this off with our icebreaker questions. Mm-hmm. You don't all have to answer both questions, so maybe, do you want me to pick? I'll pick Celia and Tamar for question number 1. So if USF had a dating profile, what would be its biggest red flag and its best quality?
You want to start?
You win.
Okay. So I would say its biggest red flag is it can be, I would say, communication. And that can lead to a lot of complicated rules that a lot of carriers may not fully understand. And so they could be caught in the weeds, or they need help to figure out those rules. And I don't think that's the intention behind the commission's actions, but communication can be a big red flag, and but we don't want that to be the issue. So, but that's a problem.
What about its best quality?
I'd say it's still loyal and dependable, because if you didn't have high cost service or program, a lot of the rural carriers and broadband providers wouldn't be able to serve underserved and unserved communities. So even though communication is a problem, you still have a loyal service that's connecting communities, and you're still able to build out infrastructure and build business through the program. So there's still room to grow, and we might need some couples counseling for it.
Absolutely. Tamar?
So I would say the biggest red flag is tedious. So talking about all those rules, right? There are reports and forms, and like you really need to pay attention to detail in USF. So I would say that's the red flag. Best quality, similar to what Celia said, is the opportunity.
Yep.
And I think of it more on the E-rate side, right? Because I've worked with so many providers who have used E-rate to enter a new market, kind of as their anchor tenant to build out their fiber, and then they get to start serving other businesses or residents, if that's their business plan, along that route.
Yep.
Very good. Okay, John and Danielle, question number 2, icebreaker question. You have to pitch the Universal Service Fund as a show or a movie. Will it be a superhero show, a cooking show, or a reality competition, and why?
I would say a reality competition. I happen to be a fan of some of those, and generally speaking, they have these skills that people are bringing in where maybe it's a social game or maybe it's a skills-based challenge. And I feel like that's a little bit with USF, that you're evolving. You're constantly going to be looking at your strategies in order to try to either increase speed or lower cost, and maybe depending on what it is you're doing, you're changing your strategy for that particular session. So I think a reality competition.
I'd agree. I'd say it's like a reality show. I think we're going to get into a little bit about USF reform and what's going on in Capitol Hill, and I think it's going to look a little bit like the game of Survivor out there.
Yes.
See what alliances get formed, see who gets voted off the island, and who surprises whom by telling them a non-truth. But I think it's a little bit like Survivor over the next year as we see USF reform take hold on Capitol Hill. Hopefully. I think we will, but we might not.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, we've been saying it's going to happen for years now, right? But I think there's a number of reasons why it should happen.
Right.
And that's why it's reality.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for playing along. I appreciate that. So we are going to ask some legal and policy questions. So let's start with the big overall question. Is USF still serving the purpose for what it was intended? When the fund was first created, has it kept up with the technology? Has it kept up with the meaning that Congress first gave the fund when it was created? Danielle?
I think that it is necessary for this fund to still exist. I think that there are so many good things that come from it, and while it is something that requires reform, and it is a program that has some difficulties keeping up with technology in the rapid pace of this industry, they are always working to try to make it better. And there are a lot of technologies, and there are a lot of different ways in which to slice the pie, and they're making the best of that by looking at, again, what are our public interest concerns, whether that happens to be affordable, is it looking at the rural aspects and trying to make broadband as well as voice services more ubiquitous. And as long as they keep those public interest concerns front and center, even while they make reforms with respect to how you distribute, how you collect, you're still needing that program.
Yes. Does everybody agree? Everybody on the panel agree the fund is still relevant? So Tamar, will you share with us?
Yeah. It's definitely still relevant, and I think the FCC has done as much as they can to keep up with technology under the current statute, right? And so that's the difficulty, is that we probably do need Congress to step in to help the FCC be able to do some things to really update the program to today's standards. They've done it a little bit with voice telephony and high cost, so you can meet that obligation with TDM or VoIP, but they haven't done that across Lifeline. And so I think there are some areas where we could use congressional help, but I agree it's definitely still relevant and still doing the best it can with the current statute to meet the public interest.
I'd like to chime in. I think some of the things that have happened over the past year have caused us to rethink about what USF is doing and what it can do. I think the pandemic taught us a lot. During the pandemic, we had 2 different low-income programs get adopted by Congress, certainly suggesting that the existing low-income program inside USF wasn't meeting the need. And so there was a compelling need to do more. There was a similar emergency program that was focused on what the need E-rate's supposed to meet, and again, there was a need to do more. We had the BEAD program, right, and that's also focused on high-cost areas, and again, suggesting that inside the USF, what the USF is capable of doing isn't enough. And then finally, in the rural healthcare, there was no adjacent program, but what we did see, and it might be the only silver lining of the pandemic, is telehealth, right? There's no going back now, but we actually see the need for people to be connected, and through rural America, to be connected to those hubs and spokes off these urban campuses that connect rural America, and that's the way healthcare is delivered in a lot of rural America. It's sort of a hub and spoke system today, and telehealth is a huge role in that.
Yes, absolutely. And Celia?
I mean, I say yes, but there's room to grow. If we don't have USF, then we don't have rural broadband carriers building out in high-cost areas. Back to my high costs. I've done a lot of work in high costs, but I think, without it, rural broadband and those challenges will just continue to grow. So it is necessary, but how we improve it, especially with the recent Supreme Court ruling and in expanding USF, is going to be a little more rigid. That's just my thoughts.
It's going to continue to be difficult. I spoke on a panel a couple weeks ago, and we raised this question and asked the audience, and a couple people said it was no longer meeting its purpose. And I think that's very different from arguing that it's just not necessary, but that the purpose has shifted. People are in a different position today. The technology is different, so maybe what we've conceived of as the fund should look different.
Well, I will add on to that. I didn't get that first icebreaker question, but I think one of the best qualities of this program is that it has ongoing operating capital that it's putting in that you're not getting elsewhere. In other words, it's not a one-time thing in terms of our dating profile, which can happen with some of these deployment funds that we're seeing appropriated by Congress. You are investing in, not just the deployment, but in the services. And so in that regard, I think this has a purpose that goes beyond some of the things we're seeing elsewhere.
I like that. You worked in it's not a one-night stand.
It's not a one-time thing.
It's a consistent, loyal relationship. That's fantastic. So we've had, some people have already used the Slido app, but I'd like to see, it doesn't tell us how many people. It does tell me? No, it tells me percentages.
It does, at the far right.
The top
it says
part.
8.
Can't see that far.
8.
Okay, fantastic. 8. There's more than 8 people in the room. Would you all weigh in? If you don't want to use the Slido app, would you raise your hand? What you know about the Universal Service Fund, does it remain necessary today? Yes, we have a lot of supporters, but still only 8 people. Okay. All right, we're not into the Slido, right? It's fine. Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about the hard stuff. That's the legal foundation in the Supreme Court, really. When we had our prep panel, I very lightly said, well, we know the Universal Service Fund is okay now. The Supreme Court has said it's okay. So we don't need to talk about that, right? And all these lawyers said yes. Yes, they want to talk about it. So let's talk about the legal foundation and what that consumers research, FCC versus consumer research decision did, what it said, and how does it shape the legal landscape for both Congress and the FCC going forward. And we don't have to go too deep into the who has authority to do what, because we'll talk about that more. But how do you see the decision? And we'll start with Tamar. What does the ruling mean? And there's more lawsuits, right?
More lawsuits, right,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think the ruling was really helpful. Everybody was, very on edge. What is the Supreme Court going to do? Is USF going to go away with the Supreme Court rules? So that was really helpful that the Supreme Court said, yes, Congress has given the FCC enough direction that they have said, these are the principles the FCC has to follow, support has to be sufficient, and it was enough guide rails that it wasn't an unconstitutional delegation of taxing power to the FCC. And of course, the Fifth Circuit has said, it was a double delegation, so bad because it went to the FCC and then the FCC went to USAC. And So I think where the Supreme Court decision was helpful and kind of settled the landscape was the FCC really is overseeing USAC. You know, they're not a lone wolf who's out there doing their own things. The FCC has control. They're setting the contribution factor. And USAC's role is really ministerial. Unfortunately, there's a dissent, right, which said that there are aspects of the program, and they're pretty big aspects of the program, right? Advanced services. And so Consumers Research has come back, and they've relied on that dissent, and they've filed in the Fifth Circuit saying, no, Congress has not given sufficient direction for supporting advanced services. And that's really what the FCC has relied on to support broadband, right? Because they've said broadband is not a telecommunications service. So this is going to play out in the courts again, unfortunately. I don't think this issue was briefed. It wasn't raised, so it hasn't been briefed. So the parties will have an opportunity to brief it in the Fifth Circuit. But I think it does introduce some more uncertainty to the program now that the FCC is going to have to think about carefully.
Absolutely. And we've seen over the years, the FCC has been very reluctant to do anything with that advanced services, broadband, VoIP, lack of classification, regulatory classification. It seems to me there's going to be a point in time where the decision is forced. Maybe it's in USF, maybe it's another area. Celia, would you like to talk about this one?
I think Tamar did a great job on it. I think that what the ruling also does is really forces the commission to really rethink how it's going to, if it's going to reform USF, how is it going to do it in a way within the statutory framework of USF? What is that going to look like? How is Congress going to react? Or are they going to push the boundaries of the Supreme Court ruling? Or are they going to risk litigation? So they're going to have to tread very carefully down this road. And I'm actually curious.
Yeah, absolutely. John?
I don't think the commission's going to do much on USF. I think that the current chair is pointing to Congress to do something, and the prior chair pointed to Congress to do something. And so I do think that the Supreme Court case does suggest that, and the Congress was waiting, frankly. They were looking at it, and they were waiting for the Supreme Court decision to come out. It's come out. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about what's going on the Hill, but I think all eyes are on Congress to do something. At the FCC, there are some things that the chairman will do. He has rolled back certain expansions of the E-rate program that happened under the prior FCC, so the Wi-Fi and school buses rather, and hotspot loaner programs got rolled back. He has certainly continued to wave the flag of waste, fraud, and abuse, and making sure waste, fraud, and abuse is not present in these programs, but I don't think there is a reform agenda at the FCC. I think it's largely waiting on Congress to do something, or the court to do something, right? That case will come again.
Right.
I agree with a lot of what John said. I will also add, in terms of the distribution side, I mean, clearly there are still things going on with respect to high cost where we have an enhanced ACAM, eligibility questions that remain. There is also, a focus on looking at RDOF 2 if that should happen. And all of those things also mean that you're going to have his administration looking a little bit more at the waste and abuse that may occur when you know that there are other programs that are helping to fund deployment and how they overlay or do not overlay, and what data do you have to support that. So maybe the form isn't the contributions and the distributions in their totality, but it's looking again at Wi-Fi on E-rate, or it's looking at how we determine what is eligible for purposes of the enhanced ACAM program.
So I do want to get into the congressional working group, starting with this question. John, you think the FCC under Chairman Carr is not inclined to take significant action? What if they do? What are the legal risks?
What if they do something? Well, I think the risks are litigation, right? I think at this point, if they do on their own rework the contribution space, right, there's going to be litigation, right?
Right.
And it's going to be, if they expand the base to include broadband, for example, the questions about the classification of broadband and whether they can do that or not will get litigated. I don't really see that they have a tether to include the tech companies, but there are creative lawyers out there, and maybe they could figure that out, and that would be litigation. So I see if they're going to do contribution reform, it's litigation. Distribution reform, they can do, right? But whether they have the appetite to do it or not is another question, right?
Yes.
There is, I think it's fair to say you should look at distribution reform before you look at contribution reform, but you don't have to do it really in a linear way. You can do it in tandem, right? It doesn't have to be a 5-year project. But I do think that there isn't a lot of sense that the FCC is looking at sort of wholesale USF reform at the moment. Chairman Carr, in the wake of that Supreme Court decision, said it's time to get going on USF and said in Congress, please. And those sentiments were echoed by the other Republican commissioner at the time, and also the Democratic commissioner, Ana Gomez, as well. So everyone's looking. I think there's a bipartisan consensus that Congress has to do something.
Anybody else have thoughts on that consensus? Is there a consensus?
I think there's largely consensus. I think that Chairman Carr, consistent with his, deregulatory, delete, right? He could identify kind of around the edges some things he wants to clean up in the programs, maybe simplify, streamline. But I agree, wholesale reform, I think Congress.
Yep.
So there was a congressional working group 2 years ago that had a pretty extensive process. Members of the industry filed comments. Our colleague Caroline brought in all kinds of people to meet with different members and their staff and talk about various solutions, and there was kind of a framework released.
Well, not released formally.
Not released formally, kind of a framework created,
Yes,
a kind of framework.
About, but no one could agree on definitions.
Definitions are a problem, as we've already stated. So now there's another congressional working group. And many of us filed comments, INCOMPAS filed comments in that process. The comments, the collection process, was not public. It's not like when the FCC has a proceeding. So some organizations made their comments public, others submitted them as sort of a placeholder. And we've all started conversations, but those conversations are a little bit stalled because of the government shutdown, even though the members' offices are still functioning. But it doesn't appear to be high on their list of priorities. They've got really difficult funding issues they've got to deal with, and lots of other issues. So do you all, as panelists and USF experts and representing clients, have a feeling, because I think it's only a feeling, it's not a fact-based issue, that the real intent of that congressional working group is to come to a solution, to have a framework? Or is there some other intent? I know, you're making stuff up, no one's going to quote you, there's no press in here.
I think they are trying to come to a consensus. I mean, this is a bipartisan topic. I mean, I think that the need for universal service affects red and blue states. And so, that's, indicated by the fact that you have senators on both sides of the aisle that are leading the charge here, and Senator Lujan and Senator Fisher. And I think that they both come at this from having concerns about bridging the digital divide. One of them is looking at it from a tribal perspective, one is looking at it from agriculture, but at the end of the day, there are an awful lot of constituents for both of them and for their peers that are interested in making sure that the reform has teeth to it, that it allows for the purpose of universal service, and how you get there is the much harder discussion. I think there's consensus to get there. How is the hard time?
That was hard. Others?
I think that it's going to be a big legislative piece of work. I don't think we're going to have a bipartisanship group just working for some piecemeal solution or small little bills to come out of it. It's going to be something big, and I hope that it also addresses the issues of affordability and sustainability of the program. I'm envisioning a big form of legislation. JSI has filed comments. We have a shrinking contribution base and a rising contribution factor. So there needs to be something big coming out of that working group, and not just for the program, but for taxpayers.
John?
I'd say, this working group is a reconstitution of the first one. They're not starting from scratch. And the first one made substantial progress toward crafting legislation that would reform the contribution side and the distribution side of USF. That effort ran out of steam as we got closer to the 2024 elections, and then one of the co-chairs, who is now the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate, John Thune, sort of shifted his attention elsewhere, and everyone else focused on the election as well. So that effort lost steam, but now it gets picked up again, and I think it's bipartisan and bicameral. There are 2 new members, one from each party in the Senate, Senator Jackie Rosen from Nevada, Democrat, Senator Sullivan from Alaska, a Republican, and you have a group of senators that include, on the Democratic side, it's Klobuchar, Peters, and Senator Ben Ray Lujan is the lead on the Democratic side. On the Senate, on the Republican side, the lead is now Senator Fisher from Nebraska. She'd not been on the working group before, and so she's now engaged and seems to have a good working relationship with Senator Lujan. Senator Capito Moran would be the other Republicans on the Senate side. And then there are, on the House side, one each. It's Subcommittee Chair, Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, Telecom Subcommittee Chair Hudson from North Carolina, Republican, and his counterpart is Ranking Member Doris Matsui from Sacramento. So that's the makeup. And you have this group of people that have largely expressed a repeated interest in the issue for years and years and years. They are very interested in this issue. And I think they are interested in the legacy of USF going back to at least the 1996 Act, this iteration, right, where it enjoyed bipartisan support, right? And there was something in it for everybody. And there was something in it for Republicans, something in it for Democrats. And I think they're trying to build upon that foundation. And I think what we're looking at now, we got to a process where different groups were able to preview the sort of framework of the legislation last time, and I think we're heading toward that again. I think I've heard they're shooting for the end of December, early January in a framework. That may be ambitious because I think it's hard to anticipate the impact of the lost amount of time that legislators have because of the government shutdown. There's just not that much real estate to work with left in this calendar year. And so I think that I'd welcome the opportunity to look at some framing by the end of the year, but I suspect it'll be the first quarter. But if it is, Staci, that's progress, right?
Absolutely.
People are actually, thinking about it and thinking about, both on the distribution side and on the contribution side, things that can work and get enough support in that working group so that they can take it to full committee and build upon it and then take it to each house.
I was actually thinking this morning, wouldn't it be great if Congress functioned the same way our elementary schools did, where there's a required number of days to be in school, and if they don't meet that because there's too many snow days or something, they tack it on at the end?
Yeah.
Chip, is that something that we can?
I think I can think back up to Article 1 through the Mid-Circuit Court of Appeals.
All right, we're not going to have the extra snow days tacked on at the end. Well, we've touched a little bit, and I know everyone's sort of reluctant to say out loud whether there's going to be conflict between what Chairman Carr has articulated and what we think Congress might do. But have there been any mixed signals? Is there anything that feels like they're working together other than Chairman Carr saying, okay, Congress, go do this? Or has Chairman Carr indicated he wants them to do something specific, especially on contribution reform, where he needs help?
Well, the chairman wrote a chapter in Project 25, right,
Indeed,
where he identified and suggested the tech companies should be contributing. And we've not seen him say a lot about that since. And so I think that he's probably taking a step back and watching things develop. And he doesn't get to tell Congress what to do, right? He can suggest that he has certain views about things, but the ball is firmly in another court, and that they will decide what to do. And I imagine if they decide it, he'll implement it. Because if it's done in 2026, it'll be passed by a Republican Senate, Republican House, and signed into law by a Republican president. I don't think there'll be daylight between what Chairman Carr thinks about USF and that piece of legislation if it were to happen next year.
Any other thoughts on that, Tamar?
Getting it done in 2026. Getting it done in 2026 seems a little aggressive, right? If we're
Ambitious.
going to do holistic USF reform on contributions and distribution, it seems to me that Congress has a lot on their plate, so I'm not.
Always do, right?
Right.
And I think, and I think it is something, it's a big piece of legislation, as Cecilia was mentioning, but big pieces of legislation can take hold in a relatively short period of time, and it's not as though they just started thinking about it in 2025 or in 2026. They've been thinking about and framing this out, and they've put pen to paper, and made a lot of progress in the last Congress, right? So, and I think that, political imperatives can, dictate the pace as well. Certain people say they want to deliver something in time for the midterm elections. That could be a reason for making things go forward. If the Fifth Circuit once again rules that some piece of the fund or some element of the program is unconstitutional, that could be the catalyst that gets people to finally do something. So I do think we're going to look at politics, right, what the midterm elections look like and what imperatives people want to say they brought home to their districts when they're going up for re-election. And I think the court case is going to also be sort of lurking in the background, and I would expect that Consumers Research would win in the Fifth Circuit again. And so we're going to have a constitutional crisis at some point in 2026 again, most likely. No, not guaranteed. I'm not wishing it, but I think that's the way it will go.
Well, this is our question for the audience, and a few people have weighed in. There are political implications. I'm not sure that my family back in Arizona is looking at what the USF contribution rate is and whether or not it needs to be reformed before the midterms. But we all get sucked in, right? We think about these things all the time. So knowing that there are midterm elections coming up next year, who thinks that Congress will act on USF reform before the elections?
Can I add?
Yes, Celia, please.
I just envision like an SUV and a sports car. Who's driving what? If you have Congress in the SUV, FCC in the sports car, right? We're all heading down this highway, same lanes, different speeds. So, as the SUV of Congress, there's guardrails and there's, legislation that could come, but at what pace? Like, are they going to stop and take photo ops on the side of the highway, slowing down? Or is the FCC, just going to, dash right through a stop sign and a red light and try to hit 6G before we finish figuring out 5G? So I think, or are the parties going to switch? I honestly can't predict. I don't think we can predict what's going to happen, but are they going to the same end goal? I think so, for universal connectivity. It's just how we get there and when we get there is going to vary.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, thank you. Let's see. So no. Very few people, 0 say yes. Congress is not going to act before the 2026 election.
John said yes.
I'm sorry?
What's that?
Yeah. John said yes.
I'm
John
in a yes
didn't get
camp.
to vote.
I have to be an optimist.
John did not
Yeah, I like that,
Spend a lot of time on the Hill
though. I like
lobbying
that.
for USF reform, and if you're not an optimist, that's a tough job.
Yeah.
So you've got to find the possible. And I think about what elected representatives will tell their constituents they've done. If your schools are not connected, you have parts of your district that you still don't have broadband, and if you have low-income folks in your district, whichever your district has, and they can't afford to stay connected, and they're not even eligible for Lifeline because their SNAP benefits have just run out, I think you've got some issues that could resonate in home town halls and the like.
So that's really interesting, John. We didn't have any questions about this, but as you said it, I'm thinking maybe your perspective is different because you're thinking about Lifeline, you're thinking about E-rate, where other folks might be thinking about the high cost fund, which your average citizen doesn't know what the high cost fund is. They know if they're connected or not, but they don't really know what's being funded and what's not. So the other programs have a more immediate personal impact, I think. And that
Lifeline is the only one that's direct to consumer, right? That's the only one that goes direct to consumer, and where consumers understand that that's a federal safety net program for them. And the other ones, the impacts of those programs are hard for consumers to appreciate because it's happening for E-rate, and they don't know why their rural hospital has broadband, but there's a USF program that made that happen.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good perspective. All right, let's talk about distribution reform. This is an area where Encompass has spent a lot of time in our advocacy. We think it's really critical. I mentioned that at the beginning. How do we know how big the pot should be if we don't know? I mean, how do we know how to hand out the money if we don't know how big the pot should be? And we don't know how big it should be because we don't know what the impact of the BEAD funding is going to be, the Capital Projects Fund, ARPA, all of these programs. And that makes the choice about what the funding, or the decision about what the funding rate should be, really difficult. So what are some ideas of the impact of assessing BEAD on how much money needs to be in the in the Universal Service Fund? Is that important? Is it universally agreed? Are there people who aren't represented here today who might disagree with that?
I think there's something to be said for, in an ideal world, waiting to see how BEAD plays out so that you can use that information to guide how to reform distribution. I think the problem is that that has some time to it. And in the interim, you still have a lessening contribution base and a need for ongoing distribution. So it isn't probably something that we can do. I mean, in an ideal world, that would be great. But I think in the interim, you're going to have, maybe it won't be, again, the wholesale. This depends a lot on a number of factors with Congress. But, at the FCC, at least, I think there will be an effort to try to, given Commissioner or Chairman Carr's need for accountability and for avoiding waste, fraud, and abuse, to take the bull by the horns and do some things to try to make sure that the distribution continues to be done in a way that is manageable.
I mean, we keep having RDOF defaults, right?
Right.
Yes, the RDOF program maybe was not as well conceived as it should have been. Maybe the rules and the participants, but whatever. But people are dropping out. It's past the time when you could then fund those locations that have dropped out through BEAD. So there is going to be, I think, a subset of locations that are not captured by BEAD and have not been captured by RDOF. And then Danielle, you made the point earlier that it's ongoing support, right? And when you get the BEAD funds, right, you build out, and there's 8 customers per mile, right? You still have to operate that network to provide them service. And so I think some of those BEAD recipients are likely going to need ongoing support to continue to provide service over those networks, right? And so the danger of waiting to assess BEAD and ARPA and all those funds is that you've left those customers who didn't get served by BEAD, didn't get served by RDOF. And so you don't want to wait another 4 years, I think, to help them.
I don't think you need to wait, but I think the idea is that you need to sort of rationalize what's going on, right? You have, BEAD is one of, according to Senator Cruz, over 100 programs the federal government has in place to fund broadband build-out. That's a lot. And if USF in the future, the high-cost program, is going to do something, I think it's reasonable to say it should do something different. Right? It shouldn't do the same thing some of the other program is doing. And so you have to understand, what the other programs are doing, what they missed, right? Did they miss something? And then in terms of OpEx, right? Should the high-cost program support OpEx or not, right? And then there are other programs that can also make those investments more meaningful. For example, those networks are going to get built in rural areas, right? A lot of those areas are poor. Right, and those constituents served by those networks probably are going to be eligible for low-income support. If they actually got that, then the carriers serving those low-income consumers would have revenue in those networks, right, that they otherwise wouldn't have. So there's sort of trying to understand how the programs can work together. But I think, the principle of, should we assess what BEAD does and wait? I think I would look at, should we assess where we're spending money and weed out duplication and focus on what's left to be done and what hasn't been done and what different the FCC's USF program, whether we call it high cost or something else, can do. So I would say you have to keep moving all the pieces at the same time, because if you go in a linear fashion, well, we'll be talking about this in 30 years, and we probably would. But we will not be doing that.
Even I won't be.
Yeah. 60 years of practicing USF would be a lot.
Ooh, no thanks.
Well, I would just say, like, you don't want to build the same house twice. So, like, that overlapping is definitely an issue. And maybe targeting the non-BEAD areas and utilizing USF to provide support, like that operational support in the non-BEAD areas to kind of fill in. But then, you could consider filling in the operating aspect within BEAD, but I think that kind of raises some issues because, it's you're supposed to build it out and have some operating capacity support there, but, we don't want people to be left behind.
Right.
So what that's going to look like, is something that, again, we have to consider, but definitely want to avoid the overlapping and providing the support in those non-BEAD areas.
Yes. Well, so it's interesting, Celia, you used the phrase, you don't want to build the same house twice. But maybe we want competition in those areas if there's private capital available. And one thing that INCOMPAS has advocated for is making sure that there isn't government funding overbuilding where our companies are investing private capital. So is that a distribution issue that can be resolved? Is that a completely different issue and we shouldn't have it on the list?
It's like a mapping issue.
It's a mapping issue.
It's a mapping.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Oh, I don't know about that.
All right, Chip wants to talk about that.
So I have two questions. You mentioned Senator Cruz, who has a much different view on USF than Senator Thune, Senator Fisher, Senator Moran, and many of the Republicans on both House and Senate. Senator Cruz is chairman of the Commerce Committee, and his former staff director is now head of NTIA at Commerce. So talk a little bit about the Cruz versus rural senators who may have a different view and how that affects this process. And then two, a technology impact. So in high cost, and as you look at BEAD, there is a decision to redo BEAD with a tech neutral approach. And to what degree would LEOs and fixed wireless as well as fiber be considered? Does the debate in BEAD on tech neutral and the cost of maybe LEOs in rural remote areas and fixed wireless impact this conversation, not only on the map, but on the technology? And then what is the Cruz dynamic and how it impacts the outcome of this Congress or next Congress USF progress?
That was a big question. That's a lot.
Yeah, that was a big question. I'm sorry
I'll
about that.
take a stab at starting at it. I think
Who would like to take Chip's question? The three questions.
Senator Cruz has a USF blueprint. It does look different than most of what most other members of Congress have said about it. He said large swaths of the USF should be appropriated, not funded through a USF fund. And I think, for example, in rural areas, he says high-cost program should not support OpEx, right? Well, and then we hopefully can declare victory on a lot of the country in terms of build out or not, right? Based on what you think about how BEAD did and the technology neutral approach that is we've seen in the benefit the bargain round, right? So I see some tension there between Cruz and his other down dais members in the Commerce Committee. But I also think that, he's going to have his say. He gets to control the committee, what goes through that committee. But I think it's interesting, Chip, that he actually he's fully aware the working group exists, right? And I think for it to exist, he had to probably at least say, okay, go forth and figure things out. And so I think that there's a willingness with Senator Cruz to, engage. And I think that He has 4 Republicans on that committee very interested in USF, with, from Shelley Moore Capito in West Virginia all the way to Senator Sullivan up in Alaska. And Alaska is a state where USF is incredibly important to make sure everyone gets connected. So I think that the distance between Senator Cruz and some of his other Republican members on these issues may not be as wide as it is perceived to be at the moment, but there's room for compromise, I think. That's the Cruz question. I forgot the 5 other ones.
I think room for compromise is a really great place to start, to stop, to be. It's a great place to be.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, I guess he could have said no working group, but.
Right. We could have said no working group. Also on technology, right? I think we now have to sort of assess the impact of BEAD and the benefit of the bargain round. We've seen 2 working group senators, in Senator Capito and Senator Fisher, Republicans, both disappointed in what their states did in the benefit of the bargain round, and feeling like they got too much, maybe a little too much LEO and not enough fiber. And then we'll see how people think about that years down the road, right? Where we're thinking like we're still not covered because we think fiber is needed everywhere. I'm not, more to come. We got a question in the audience. That relieves us from the rest of Chip's questions.
Question from the audience.
Thank you for your discussion. I find it really interesting and lovely talking to such a great panel of experts. I started my company in Australia, and I would love to get your opinions on what you think maybe another jurisdiction, another country has done well that maybe we should emulate. I know the NBN was part of the Australian rollout for the first financial crisis, and that was bringing, high-speed broadband to, rural Australia. And I'm not saying it was good or bad, I just know they did that. And I'd love to know if there was other programs that you think that we should be emulating or different countries that have solved problems for rural access, whether it's data or telecommunications, and maybe we can learn from others.
I think that's a really interesting question. I haven't focused much on the Australian program for several years, but I understand it was not entirely successful. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, they did roll it out, and I know you have mixed reviews, but it was part of their economic boost, and they wanted to make it as fast as Korea, and obviously you're dealing with a much smaller population and landmass of the United States, continental United States, so but there might be some other solutions, it's satellite, and maybe there's a combination of a technology perspective and a public policy perspective, which is the ultimate goal of getting rural people access to data, because we will have the have and have-nots without, and we've saw that in the pandemic, of people without access, whether the kids were using their mom's phone to log on, right? So I'd love to see if any programs around the world that you think were interesting or innovative.
Do you all have any experience, knowledge of other programs, other countries?
This is United States. We generally don't look to other countries.
But we can learn.
But I'm not saying we shouldn't, right? But it generally, our policy making is very insular. And so what we sometimes do instead is look at the states, right? And we say, hey, is there any particular thing going on in an individual state that is worthy of replication, or it can be used as a model? And, for example, the biggest part of the digital divide in rural America and elsewhere is not access to networks. It's affordability. It's the biggest part of the digital divide by a wide margin. And so we currently have a USF program called Lifeline that has a participation rate of about 20% and provides a subsidy of $9.25, which doesn't get you a lot of broadband. And so what has worked in the States is California's got a supplemental study, a subsidy of about $20. When you get close to $30, you have a meaningful subsidy that you actually can attract investment, and carriers will actually participate in that program. So that's one example. New York State is another example where New York State has mandated low-income pricing price regulation for providers. And I think, after years of litigation, it's finally the law. And how successful that will be, I think, remains to be seen. I don't think it will be successful. I don't think carriers will be, advertising the side of buses here, get your mandated $15 broadband in New York. And so I think that the carriers, aren't in the business of losing money, right? These are publicly traded companies. They can't lose money. So those, are two examples of looking at the states for models. But I have to confess, I don't know about international models to borrow from. It's a great question, something we should certainly think more about.
It is. And I think it's...
I think especially in this show, we can learn from each other, but learn from other countries and other jurisdictions and what's working, what's not. Because in this room, we're the ones who will be making change and public policy. And if we don't know about it, how can we go forward,
Well, I would also add, the commission has an international visitors program, and you will, if you go to the website, you can see how the commission, I think you can get some idea of like how the commission has interacted with international bodies and countries, and those countries will come to the commission and meet with the chairman and commissioners.
Even in MySpace, which is text messaging, we submitted what we thought was a better solution for the ACMA with different numbering schematics to deal with, text messaging fraud. If it's machine to machine, you've got a different numbering schematics, maybe less regulations, less where a VoIP should not have any differential between, a P2P application. So there's things, but it was great where the ACMA opened it up, and that was fantastic, right? And they questioned us and hey, what did you think of this? So we can hopefully make change in public policy.
Well, there's also an Office of International Affairs within the commission, and there are staff that are designated for certain areas around the country. So I think a part of it is also where your policy and advocacy comes into play, and building a relationship with the commission. And then I don't have any expertise on this subject, but like the undersea submarine cables, I don't know how that's evolving or if that's relevant, but how those connections are panning out, you could probably stay abreast of that. I'm just kind of, I'm trying to think, But.
Well, I would say that USF is a particularly unique issue, even with the example that you provided with Australia, because of where our population centers are, because of the geography and topography, the policies look very different from policies that might be successful in other countries. So you might be able to take kind of the kernel of what other countries have done, but it's not necessarily the case that it's going to work in the United States. And that makes USF a very unique program when compared with a lot of other regulatory programs that the FCC oversees.
Yeah.
So I'm not dismissing your idea, but I think it makes it much more difficult.
But certainly, if Australia is a good model,
Yes.
right? Or if you know of others, I think the FCC is open to being told they need to ask different questions, right? You can go into the FCC and say, what about this? Have you thought about this? Have you looked at other jurisdictions? And I think their first reaction is going to be the USF is different. The United States USF is different, but it doesn't hurt to ask the questions.
Yeah,
This is no different than our healthcare system, or we just don't ask questions.
Yeah.
We don't look at other solutions. We think we put our blinders on and think we're the best without learning.
I would say, as Congress is looking at reforming USF, the process is remarkably open. And anytime I take people up to the Hill, they're amazed, right, that you just walk in, right? And you have to have meetings, you set up the meetings, but you can have these meetings. Anybody can ask for a meeting. You can have a meeting and say, I want to talk about USF issues. At the commission, should Congress pass legislation, they'll have a rulemaking. because you have to translate the statute into rules, right? And that process is also remarkably open. You have the opportunity to file comments, and then after the comments, you can file replies. You can always have ex parte meetings in person. You can file letters, and so at any point in time, you can say, hey, have you looked at the Australian model on how to do this?
Yes.
So I think, while we may not have legislators and regulators, their first thought may not be, hey, what's going on in Australia or Europe? They certainly are open to hearing about those ideas, and there's a process that's very open to considering them and giving you the opportunity to present.
Right, I think that's a great point, John, that you can file comments at the FCC. I don't know if you've been part of that process.
Senator Rosen.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
So you're already in. Okay, you know how to work the system then. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Fantastic. So this has been a great conversation with members of the audience. I don't want to put an end to that. But if folks don't have any more questions, oh my goodness, we do. Okay.
This might be a little bit off topic.
Would you mind waiting for the microphone? Hurry. It's a big room.
Come on, Caroline, hustle.
Hi, thank you. This might be a little bit of a sidebar question, but since we're talking about USF and we're talking about BEAD and Lifeline and the old RDOF and all that stuff, do you see a resurrection of the ACP coming back to help in
It is not
those-
off topic at all.
Can you repeat the
because,
question?
a lot of those rural
Resurrection
areas
of ACP.
are also, high poverty areas, and they probably can't afford all the investment that's being made there. So what are your thoughts about that?
So I want to add on to that before our panelists answer the questions. One of the pressure points when the Congressional Working Group was looking at these issues in the past was the expiration of the ACP program, or of ACP. And we don't have that pressure point now,
Right.
other than the extremely high contribution rate. So, thinking about, there was bipartisan support for ACP. We just didn't get enough votes to be able to extend it. It's a very popular program with consumers. Can we change Lifeline to look more like ACP? Is there momentum in that direction? And, is that something that would take pressure off Congress to act, or is it completely separate?
You want to start?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I don't see the FCC adopting a higher subsidy. While I agree that $9 Lifeline is not enough, I think the FCC has said Lifeline is full of waste, fraud, and abuse, and they're not going to increase that subsidy unless they get direction from Congress. And I think Congress looked at aspects of ACP as being full of waste, fraud, and abuse, and I think there were proposals to try and get rid of some of that and tighten up ACP, and if they could get to agreement on that, then it could be included in the broader USF legislation. But John, what are your thoughts about ACP alone?
I think ACP is gone, and it's not coming back. And something that looks like it could be a reformed program inside the USF that currently is called Lifeline. It may not be called Lifeline 2 years or 3 years from now. It probably wouldn't be called ACP either, because that program was successful, 23 million households participating and then 23 million households not participating. There's some brand damage there that I don't think that brand's going to get resuscitated. But Staci, to your point, inside the USF program, the Lifeline program can be changed to look and take on certain aspects of the ACP that made it successful. The most important aspect of the ACP that made it successful was a $30 subsidy level. It attracted fixed providers, it attracted mobile providers to compete for these consumers that aren't used to having anybody compete for their business, right? So that subsidy level was important, and it was interesting because the emergency broadband benefit had a $50 subsidy level, and they reduced it to $30, and there still was competition for these consumers, and they were still able to get access to entry-level broadband plans. Nobody was getting a Cadillac plan for $30, but they were getting meaningful access for the first time that wasn't available through the Lifeline program, or even perhaps through some of the, the cable companies' Essentials branded type programs, where it's good to have some access, but it wasn't, sort of this, the entry-level retail access that most of us are used to or better. So certain things about ACP can be blended into Lifeline. Certain things about Lifeline are worth keeping. For example, Senator Cruz criticized the ACP because 40% of the population was eligible for it. Lifeline has got tighter eligibility criteria. Lifeline's eligibility base is about 30% smaller than ACP. It's a meaningful difference. And I think, and we're going to talk about, some of the trends that we're going to see, it's making sure we're getting help where it's truly needed, whether it's in a rural area that's truly needed, or whether it's to consumers who truly need the support, or schools that truly need the support, right, or hospitals, right? So it's that targeting, and then on the waste, fraud, and abuse front, it is interesting, but the National Verifier is a bulwark against the waste, fraud, and abuse in the Lifeline program, and it works well. In most instances, there are certain aspects of it where it doesn't work particularly well. And in the ACP, some of the problems that you saw was that not all the providers had to use that National Verifier framework.
I think the other thing is, Lifeline has had a lot of providers leave that program because they have a lot more obligations as an eligible telecommunications carrier that wasn't part of the ACP program. So if there is some reform, maybe there will be a differentiator in terms of how carriers participate, and not necessarily carriers then, providers, in a program that would be, a blend of Lifeline and ACP. Unfortunately, I think a lot of companies, shy away from being labeled an eligible telecommunications carrier because of some of the regulations that come with that.
Yeah, I think what we call the ETC designation requirement, that's eligible telecommunications carrier. You have to be one of those to participate in Lifeline. That's probably too much to ask for most fixed providers to do. And yet not having it, which is what we had in the ACP program, I think also created a vector for non-compliance, if not fraud, because a lot of the new market entrants, I don't think, fully appreciated the compliance load and complexity of how hard it was to actually to stand up a wireless business inside a subsidy program and get it all right. And
So if it's an attractive program, but there are parts of it that haven't worked. Celia, you opened up talking about the importance of affordability. And are there other features that are part of Lifeline, part of ACP, something entirely new that we haven't considered that we might want to be proposing to Congress as they're working through this working group process?
I would probably say more incentives for carriers, like more performance-based, and like incentivizing that type of involvement by the carriers could be helpful, and I think it could help avoid overlapping in areas as well, because the carriers are feeling happy about their work because they're getting rewarded in some way or fashion, and so the build-outs continue. There's a better relationship with the community because they're getting services. But again, I still lean more on that affordability, sustainability. Like we need that, especially without ACP and Lifeline needing some modernization and reform. But that's really like my position. And I know I've spoken with clients who actually miss ACP. I mean, it was a good source of business for our clients. And the question is it coming back? And I agree with John, I don't think so in the way it was. So, but I won't push it aside as impossible.
One incentive we haven't talked about in terms of getting carriers to participate in a program like a low-income program is what we call a safe harbor. The ACP had a safe harbor. Lifeline doesn't. And so the safe harbor is intended to mean that the national verifier verifies the consumer as being eligible to participate in the program. Should they find later on that's not the case, the carrier is not left holding the bag and they're not asking the carrier for money again. And that doesn't exist in Lifeline. And I will tell you that we have situations where We have audits and we have findings that go back years and years and years, 6 years. In fact, I've got one open where the government says, oh, we made a mistake and you need to give us money.
Right.
It's hard to get carriers to get excited about participating in a program with that kind of overhang.
Absolutely. Well, I was worried we were going to have a lot of time left at the end, and I've got like 20 more questions that I'm not going to get to, but I want to give the audience one more opportunity to speak.
Hey, Staci.
It doesn't need a lot of encouragement. There we go.
Last week, the NTIA administrator made some comments about BEAD and essentially said that if you accept BEAD, you won't be able to get USF support on, I think, the network portion of the BEAD award. And just wanted to get y'all's comments on that. Is that legal? Does she have the legal authority to do that? And how you see this playing out? Because we talked about a lot of people took BEAD with maybe getting additional USF support later. Does it mean I can't sell E-rate on those BEAD networks? Rural hospital, Lifeline customers maybe there. So I just wanted to get y'all's comments on that.
That's an amazing
I saw the comment,
Yeah.
and I had the same concern you did. I thought, oh, that's interesting. What is meant by that comment? And I haven't dug into it, haven't explored it, haven't said, Ariel, what did you mean? Right? But I imagine the thrust of the comment was that if you get support to build your network from BEAD, you shouldn't get support from a high-cost fund, a USF high-cost fund to support building your network.
Building, right.
But that, it's not clear, right? I mean, and if you do build that network and the economics are thin, like you had expressed before, 8 customers per mile or something like that, will you have enough subscribers, even if they're able to get Lifeline, to have enough revenue on that network to make it work? Or will you need support for OpEx? So I don't know exactly what was meant by those comments, and I expect that those will be clarified some.
Thank you for taking the bait. I didn't want to answer that question. Okay, we just have a couple minutes. Oh, no, we just have 41 seconds.
Quick question. So you talked about the duplicate programs and how to sort them out. One of the questions I have is, can you use your speed testing as a way of sorting out the good carriers and the bad carriers per se, and awarding the highest speed rated carrier as the recipient of the NUSF funding in an area? In Nebraska, we had 2 reverse auctions last year. We had extreme success with it, with Windstream and Frontier and CenturyLink territories. Where I'm going with this is that there was funding available in certain census blocks, and with the auctions, the state got the maximum benefit from the carriers' contributions with the lowest payout to those areas. Is that a model that you could look at as far as nationwide? Across the board as like an auction type scenario, and then backing up your results with your speed testing to prove that you actually did what you said you were going to do?
Well, I will jump in here. I will say that, I think that they're always looking at these programs, and John said it earlier, in terms of how the states have been handling it to understand, what might be a good model. And I also think that there are instances where we are looking to incentivize providers in order to try to be more cost effective and get higher speeds. We're going back to one of the first icebreaker questions. It's a reality competition, and there's going to be some strategies here. And at the end of the day, I don't think it's a one size fits all when you speak about nationwide. Unfortunately, I think there are probably going to be some differentiators.
Well, the thing about it is, with the Nebraska auctions that we had, was that the Public Service Commission paid 50% of the funding up front, which incentivized us to go out and build those areas right off the bat. And then we were motivated even more because we had to do the test results to get the other 50% of funding. So we immediately started marketing to those areas before we even put a plow on the ground. And so our results, the Public Service Commission of Nebraska was able to push that money so much further than if they would have just simply handed that money, that NUSF money, off to Windstream or Frontier or CenturyLink. I mean, they really doubled the numbers of homes that they passed when it was all said and done.
I think it's a really interesting idea, and it kind of goes to the first question. Has the current Universal Service Fund outlived its usefulness? Maybe we say yes. Maybe it's outlived its usefulness, not the importance of the purpose, and maybe there's other ways to achieve it.
Yeah.
Achieve the goal of universal connectivity, not just the connection, but the affordability and a high-speed quality connection, right? Okay, we're way over time. I want to do real quick lightning round. What is the one criteria that you want Congress and the FCC to include in its revamp of distribution and contributions? The one idea, one word.
Forever.
Forever. Excellent.
Tech neutrality.
Tech neutrality.
Accountability.
Very good.
I think operating expense. Can't forget that in light of all the deployment.
Operating expense.
There you go.
I always say integrity. Whenever anybody asks me a one-word question, I always say integrity. Like, we have to have that, right?
We do.
Hard to be against integrity.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the conversation, and thank you, all of you.